Judge Harold Brenner thought he was about to sentence a naive teenager until the defendant began dismantling the case as if he were a lawyer with years of experience. The air inside the Los Angeles County courtroom felt heavy, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators packed the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The defense table seemed too large for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin raised just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Mateo Ramirez, 18, accused of car theft and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Brenner looked at him made it clear that the real trial had little to do with the law. Brenner leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lazily on the polished surface of his bench. He peered at Mateo over the rim of his glasses, his lips curling into something that wavered between mockery and disdain. "Do you think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a dry, almost amused tone. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles spread through the room. The bailiff, the court reporter, even the prosecutor, they all seemed in on the joke. Mateo didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment, not this one specifically. He never planned to be in the defendant's seat, but he knew the dynamics of a courtroom like the back of his hand. While other teenagers memorized basketball stats, he memorized legislation. While his friends played video games, he staged mock trials in his head, debating imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Rosa Ramirez, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. Mateo grew up listening to the stories she brought home, how prosecutors sometimes cut corners, how judges had favorites, how many public defenders could barely do their jobs adequately. He absorbed it all. By 14, he could analyze a trial with more detail than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Brenner. To him, Mateo was just another troubled teen. "Let's make this quick," Brenner sighed, glancing at the case file. "I've got a golf game at 2. The audience laughed again, but this time something shifted. Mateo's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile because Brenner had just made his first mistake. The room hadn't noticed yet. The prosecutor, Gina Ellsworth, rose from her seat with the poise of someone who had already won. Her suit was impeccable, her blouse and tailored blazer exuding confidence, and her voice carried the rehearsed assurance of someone who had delivered the same speech hundreds of times. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Mateo Ramirez was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown Los Angeles, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." Her words landed with weight. The gallery stirred, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it all sounded conclusive: a stolen car, a chase, an attempt to escape. Judge Brenner glanced at Mateo over his glasses, then turned his gaze back to Ellsworth. "Proceed." The prosecutor strode toward the jury box, her steps echoing against the floor with practiced confidence. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Ramirez is a victim of circumstance." The prosecutor turned, fixing her gaze on Mateo for the first time. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim flees from the police?" The tension in the Los Angeles County courtroom grew thicker. Judge Brenner leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Mateo didn't even blink. Gina Ellsworth continued, glancing at a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Samuel Tren, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to escape. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was conducted by the book." Brenner let out a puff of air through his nose, nodding. "Seems straightforward enough." To most people in the room, it probably was: a stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Mateo had spent too many years studying trials to miss the cracks in the story. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Brenner tapped his gavel lightly on the bench. "All right, let's hear from the defense." He turned to Mateo's assigned public defender, a woman named Isabel Torres, who had barely spoken 3 words since entering the courtroom. She stood, visibly nervous. "Your Honor, my client." Mateo placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. For the first time, Mateo spoke. "I'll represent myself, Your Honor." The room fell utterly silent. Judge Brenner stared at him, clearly amused. "You're going to represent yourself?" Mateo's voice came out calm and steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll handle my own defense." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The bailiff raised his eyebrows. Prosecutor Ellsworth let out a quick laugh. This should be interesting. But no one found it funny when Mateo took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the room settled on Mateo as he adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets. He let the silence linger just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then finally he spoke. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Ellsworth raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Go ahead." Mateo took a slow step forward. "You said Officer Samuel Tren personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest, correct?" Ellsworth exhaled, almost bored. "That's right." "And that testimony is in his written report, correct?" "Of course." Mateo nodded, then turned to Judge Brenner. "Your Honor, I move to have that testimony excluded as evidence." Brenner frowned. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Mateo pulled his hands from his pockets and pointed toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Tren never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Ellsworth's face. "What are you talking about?" Mateo stepped forward again. "Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to request verification of Officer Tren's GPS records from that night. If his report claims he saw me in the vehicle, those records should match his location." He let the sentence hang in the air. "I have a feeling they won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Brenner looked at Ellsworth. "Counselor, any objection to checking the GPS records?" Ellsworth swallowed, her jaw tight. The pause was long enough for the jury, the audience, and especially the judge to notice her hesitation. Mateo took a deep, silent breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying how prosecutors moved, how they used the system, and he knew one thing for certain: if Ellsworth were fully confident in her case, she wouldn't be stalling. Judge Brenner sighed, rubbing his temples. "Counselor, any objections?" Ellsworth shook her head reluctantly. "No, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, no one was laughing. The room remained silent, but the tension was palpable. Ellsworth began shuffling her papers, her polished confidence fraying at the edges. "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Mateo nodded, his face calm. "That's true." He took another step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Brenner raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Mateo turned to the jury, making eye contact with each member. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints on a car proves I stole it. That's the story they're trying to sell you. But let's think logically." He paused to take a breath, keeping his tone calm and controlled. "Imagine you walk into a store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, zip it up, maybe hang it back on the rack and leave. Hours later, someone steals that jacket. Does finding your fingerprints on it prove you took it?" Some jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the audience muttered under their breath. Mateo didn't give them time to respond. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven for hours before the alleged theft. "I was at that store with 3 friends. Yes, as we passed by the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it looked suspicious. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from it. It was a dumb moment of curiosity." He let the words sink in before delivering his next question with surgical precision. "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Prosecutor Ellsworth cleared her throat, flipping through her notes, searching for a strategy to regain control. Mateo pressed on, giving her no respite. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint evidence was obtained." He turned to Brenner. "Your Honor, has the forensic specialist in this case been called to testify?" Brenner blinked, surprised by the question. He looked at Ellsworth, who hesitated before admitting no. Mateo's lips tightened with understanding. "So, let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try to convict me, but they didn't think it necessary to bring the specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or questioned the accuracy of the analysis. Ellsworth's mouth shut tightly. Mateo nodded, as if her silence confirmed his point. Interesting. Judge Brenner sighed, pressing the bridge of his nose with his fingers. He looked like someone realizing this case wasn't going to be the simple formality he had expected. But Mateo wasn't done. What he would say next would change everything. Mateo took another step, his voice steady but calm. Your Honor, I'd like to submit as evidence an official statement from the vehicle's owner, Mateo said. Judge Brenner frowned. The owner? Mateo nodded. Yes, Mr. Luis Mendoza, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never included in the prosecution's documents. And I think I know why. He turned to Ellsworth. Do you recall what Mr. Mendoza told the officers the night he reported his car stolen? Ellsworth's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what was coming. Mateo didn't wait for her response. He pulled a printed transcript from his folder and read aloud, I left the car running while I went into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and driven off. But it wasn't the guy they arrested. I saw the kid and he was white. A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom. Mateo held up the paper. That's in the original police report, the same one the prosecution chose to ignore. He turned his gaze to Judge Brenner. The officer who arrested me omitted this in his testimony. The prosecution overlooked it. Yet they want the jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Ellsworth took a hurried step forward. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Mateo shook his head. I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but it carried with force. I was detained several blocks from where the vehicle was abandoned. I was walking home after buying snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car, near it, or running from anything. The only thing linking me to this case is sloppy police work and your rushed assumptions. Judge Brenner let out a long sigh, massaging his temple. The case was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Mateo turned to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a Latino kid in the same area and decided that was good enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence fell. Brenner cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Anything further from the prosecution? Ellsworth stood rigid, her face flushed. No, Your Honor. Judge Brenner exhaled, studying Mateo for a long moment before looking at the jury. Finally, he tilted his head and spoke the words that would be etched in everyone's memory. Case dismissed. A brief moment of stunned silence preceded the chaos. Half the room erupted in murmurs, some incredulous, others relieved. Reporters began scribbling in their notebooks. Mateo stood still, letting the moment sink in. Judge Brenner, gavel still in hand, gave Mateo a look that held something new, recognition, perhaps even a hint of remorse. Mateo met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Ramirez. Mateo paused, but didn't turn around. Brenner hesitated, then said, You should consider studying law. Mateo gave a slight, sideways smile. He didn't need to consider it, he was already on his way. Outside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air buzzed with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended like weapons. Mateo, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do now? How does it feel to outsmart a prosecutor with years of experience? Mateo pulled up the hood of his sweatshirt. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving his intelligence, it was about something bigger. His mother, Rosa Ramirez, waited at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She studied him for a moment, then shook her head and let out a sigh. My son, you nearly gave me a heart attack. Mateo scratched the back of his neck, chuckling. Had to take the risk, Ma. She looked at him for another second, then pulled him into a tight hug. You've always been the stubborn one in the family. Camera flashes continued, but Mateo had stopped paying attention. Across the street, leaning against his car, Judge Brenner watched, his earlier arrogance replaced by something like reflection. He hadn't imagined this case would be anything more than routine. Another day, another defendant, another guilty verdict. But now he knew he'd remember this trial for a long time. Because Mateo had done something few achieve, he forced the system to confront itself. And for once, the system backed down. This is the lesson we should all learn. How many other cases are resolved the same way? How many people are found guilty not based on real evidence, but on biases, shortcuts, or a system more interested in closing files than finding the truth? Mateo had the knowledge to defend himself, but what about those who don't? This wasn't just about one case, it was about all of them. Mateo knew what he had to do next. This wouldn't be the last courtroom he'd step into, but the next time, he wouldn't be the defendant, he'd be the lawyer. And when that day came, he wouldn't be alone. If this story made you think, even for a moment, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we force them to. Like, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, the defendant might not be Mateo, it might be someone you know.